Hi, welcome back to A Moment with Marta. So I want to continue our behavior series. So the first video, we kind of talked about looking for the function of the behavior, looking at what's triggering the behavior, the antecedent, and then what is the natural consequence that occurs after the behavior. And then last week, we looked at how we can collect data on the precursor behaviors for the more severe behaviors. And the example of problem behavior that we did last week was headbanging. So let's continue on with that, and let's look, now that we've established that our precursor behaviors to headbanging is screaming and vocalizations. So what do we do with that? Then we can kind of come up with a plan, a treatment plan, if you will, on what we can do to help that child, that student, that individual, what we can do to kind of prevent those precursor behaviors, which will then in turn prevent that more severe behavior that's more harmful. So let's say that the situation is a child makes a mistake and is very hard on him or herself, and therefore starts to get agitated, starts to scream and make vocalizations, and then the end result is headbanging. So we've established that screaming and vocalizations are precursor behaviors. So what we can do is we can teach this child to say, I need help. Or, if it's a thing where they're feeling a certain way, we can get them to communicate that. So all behavior is communication. I mean, every person is communicating. It might not be verbal, but the behaviors themselves are communicating something, a need, a want, something that's going on internal. So in this instance, we would want to teach this child to ask for help. And that would in turn prevent the screaming and the vocalizations, which would then in turn prevent the headbanging. And you can do it wherever that child's at. If they're able to communicate full sentences, you just prompt them, I need help, please. If they're not there yet and they're just doing simple phrases, you can say, I need help. If they're not there yet and they're just doing one word, they can do help, or they can point to pictures using the pecs. You could do something like, make something like this, things that they want, things that they're feeling. And for that instance, you would put a help icon. I don't have an example of one, but this is basically, it's a laminated paper, and there's just various things. There's nap, break, water, a walk. So you could make a help icon and they could just peel it off and give it to you, or point to it. You could teach them the sign for help. There's lots of different ways that you could teach them. So you don't have to worry about them needing to be able to vocalize in order to help them be able to communicate that their need is they need help in that given moment in time. And the same is true for feelings. If it's just a thing where they're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, frustrated, you could do the same kind of thing where you have feelings and you can just teach them to be able to communicate that feeling and therefore their needs and what's going on internally. That's hard for children anyway, to be able to know what's happening internally. A lot of times, like for anxiety and frustration, there might be anger, there might be their stomach hurts, they might have a harder time focusing. So it does take a little bit of deductive reasoning to figure some of it out. If your child is not able to verbally communicate as much, you have to really pay attention to the antecedent, what's triggering the behaviors, what is this child trying to tell me in this given moment in time. So for the purposes of this example, we're simply saying that the child is working on an assignment for school and is making a mistake and is very hard on him or herself and is getting very frustrated. So rather than getting to that point where he gets so excited and escalated, we can give him the tools, being able to say, I need help, or point to it, establishing in some way, shape, form, or fashion that he needs help. And therefore, that's going to stop the precursor behaviors, which will in turn stop the more severe behaviors. And you can do that with anything. I did an example of self-injurious behavior. You could do it with property destruction. You could do it with aggression of some sort. You could do it with any kind of behavior that you're collecting data on. Just collect that data, figure out what's happening before, figure out what the behaviors are happening prior to the behavior that you're wanting to help your child work through, and then come up with a goal, come up with a plan. If they're older, involve them in that plan. Inside, they're there. They don't have developmental delays or intellectual delays if you're looking just strictly at autism. And so you want to approach them with dignity and with respect. So for example, my 9.5-year-old son, I include him in conversations when I'm talking with his speech therapist or with others about what our plan is moving forward and how we can best support him. Because it's about him, it's his life, and he needs to have a say. And, you know, nobody wants to be talked about why you're right there, and it's about you, and you know, it can be kind of demeaning. So we always want to approach from a place of dignity and respect, and treating that child the age that they are, regardless of how they're able to communicate verbally or what types of behaviors they might display. So I talk to my son like he's a typical 9.5-year-old kid, and I involve him as is appropriate for a 9.5-year-old. And we talk about, okay, here's your responsibility. Your responsibility is to tell me what you want, and you can do it this way. And my responsibility is to interpret what you're saying and to be able to provide for those needs. So we have that give and take conversation and relationship, and you can do that with your student, with your child. If you're a therapist, as you're working with a child and partnering with a parent, it's really important, parents, that you're involved. Even you working parents, I know it's so difficult because you're just juggling things, and you're working and you're trying to make sure that you're spending time with your kid and making sure they get what they need. But be involved, whatever it is that your child is doing, whether it's you're staying in contact with their teacher at school, or you're in contact with their therapist, you are aware of what exactly the goals are and what's being worked on, and that way you can implement it when you're there, and when you are off work and you're with your child, and there can be that consistency, and there can be that that the same language that's being used is used all over the place. And so it gives better consistency, and therefore it gives that child just a much better success rate. You want to set them up for success. You don't want to set them up to where they're going to fail and then feel like, well, the only way I get attention is through doing whatever the problem behavior is. When they have behaviors like that, they're desperately trying to tell us something. They're telling us that something's going on in their body, or something's going on in their environment, or something's not right in some other way. If they're struggling with understanding or grasping a certain concept, simply because the language is just not quite focusing in, those are things that matter, that any other child might struggle with, but you just have to do a little bit more deductive reasoning. So for example, my son, I figured out that his left cheek and his left ear get bright red when he has a headache. He's not able to communicate to me that his head hurts. and we're just not there yet. Now, at some point, you know, I want to be able to have him point that I feel and that he's hurting, or have a pain chart that shows different parts of the body that he can point to and indicate to me what's hurting. But for now, we don't have that. We're not there yet. We're working on it. But what I do know is that he has a physical manifestation, and if he starts to get a little bit more irritable and upset and his anxiety levels are a little bit higher, I look and see if there's that physical sign. And the only reason I know that is because I tried everything else. I didn't understand why his cheek and ear were red on that side, and I would take his temperature and it was normal on the right side and just slightly elevated on the left. Not even a fever, just slightly elevated, and I finally was able to clue in, oh, he's got a headache. Well, no wonder. I don't feel good when I have a headache either, and it was him trying to express that, and I just wasn't understanding it. So don't ever underestimate them. Behavior is a form of communication, but what we want to do is get them to where they're not having to resort to those behaviors in order to convey what they're wanting or what they're needing. So that's kind of how you can start to get towards a treatment plan. And you know, you can just write it down on a notebook and post it. It doesn't have to be fancy. If you have access to a laminator, it's really easy, and you can do the Velcro dots, or you could just take pictures around the house and your child could flip through and then, you know, point to whatever it is that they're wanting or needing, and you can give them and empower them with those tools for communication. And so just meet them wherever they're at. And thanks for listening. Until next time on A Moment with Marta. Bye.